North Atlantic, May 1943. The sea is black, the air biting cold. Rain lashes against the conning tower of U-boat U-230, slicing through fog that feels almost alive. Inside the steel tube, 44 men move in silence, tired, pale, and soaked in diesel fumes. The periscope rises once, cutting through the gray surface like a blade. On the horizon, faint, rhythmic dots. Not merchant ships, not helpless targets, but aircraft, radar-equipped, American. A blip on the Allied screen miles away flashes. Contact confirmed. Engines roar. A B-24 Liberator dives from the clouds, depth charges armed. Below, panic spreads. Alarm! Dive! Echoes through the hull as ballast tanks flood. Moments later, the Atlantic erupts. Columns of water explode into the sky. In 1 minute, the hunters become the hunted. By dawn, the ocean is calm again. But another German submarine is gone. Across the Atlantic, Allied commanders mark one more red cross on the map. The tide has turned. Germany's invisible weapon, the U-boat, is dying beneath the waves it once ruled. September 1939. When war returned to Europe, Germany looked to the sea. The memory of World War I's blockade still haunted Berlin. Britain had strangled Germany by cutting its lifelines across the Atlantic. This time, Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the German submarine arm, vowed it would be different. The ocean would no longer be Britain's shield. It would be its graveyard. At the outbreak of war, Germany possessed barely 57 operational U-boats, far fewer than Dönitz had dreamed of. But he believed in the asymmetric power of the submarine. With a single torpedo, one U-boat could destroy thousands of tons of Allied shipping. Grain, oil, munitions, the very lifeblood of an island nation. The Kriegsmarine called it the tonnage war. Sink faster than the Allies could build, and victory would follow. By early 1940, the plan was working. The seas west of Ireland turned into killing grounds. British convoys scattered under cover of fog. Merchant ships burned through the night, lighting up the dark Atlantic like floating pyres. The U-boats moved unseen, striking, vanishing, and striking again. This was the beginning of what German sailors called Die glückliche Zeit, the happy time. Between 1940 and 1941, U-boat commanders became national heroes. Men like Günther Prien, who slipped into the British naval base at Scapa Flow and sank the battleship Royal Oak under Churchill's nose. Otto Kretschmer, master of precision attacks, who sank over 200,000 tons of Allied shipping. Their photos filled propaganda posters. Their patrol logs read like tales of ancient hunters. The Allied navies, still unprepared for the scale of the submarine threat, scrambled to respond. Britain's Royal Navy tried convoy systems, grouping merchant ships under escort, but the U-boats adapted faster. They hunted in Wolfpacks, radio-coordinated groups that would swarm convoys at night. A single sighting report could summon 10 submarines to one target, each taking turns firing torpedoes. For Britain, the results were devastating. By the end of 1940, over 2,300 Allied merchant ships had been sunk. Nearly 7 million tons of vital cargo lost. Food and fuel shortages gripped the British Isles. The Royal Navy couldn't cover every route. The Atlantic had become a deadly chessboard, and Germany was playing every move right. Meanwhile, in Berlin, Dönitz urged Hitler to expand submarine production. He wanted 300 U-boats, enough to shut down the Atlantic entirely. But the Führer's attention was elsewhere, on grand battleships, and soon the invasion of the Soviet Union. The U-boat fleet grew, but never fast enough to match Dönitz's ambition. Still, by mid-1941, the undersea campaign seemed unstoppable. The fall of France had handed Germany a priceless gift, Atlantic ports at Brest, Lorient, and Saint-Nazaire. From these bases, U-boats could strike deep into the mid-Atlantic, beyond the reach of British patrol aircraft. The ocean's Black Gap, a stretch of open water where convoys had no air cover, became a graveyard. Survivors spoke of nights lit only by burning oil and of the endless sound of explosions echoing through the fog. In those years, Germany's undersea war wasn't just a strategy. It was a symbol. The U-boat represented stealth, technology, and the illusion of invincibility. Newspapers called it the invisible weapon. Propaganda films showed submariners laughing as they watched Allied ships sink through periscopes, confident that no force could touch them. But beneath the triumph lay a fragile truth. Each U-boat was a sealed coffin of steel. Conditions were brutal. Air thick with carbon dioxide, humidity dripping from bulkheads, the stench of fuel and unwashed bodies everywhere. Crews slept next to torpedoes and ate canned rations crawling with mold. When depth charges rolled down through the water, men clutched pipes and prayed as the hull screamed. Still, they believed in Dönitz's promise that Germany's submariners were turning the tide of the war. They didn't yet know that the Allies were learning faster than anyone imagined. New tools, new codes, and new eyes in the sky were quietly taking shape. And within 2 years, that invisible ocean empire would begin to crumble. By early 1942, the ocean's balance began to shift. What had once been Germany's vast hunting ground was becoming an increasingly dangerous place for the hunters themselves. Beneath the surface victories and propaganda glory, Allied science and industry were quietly sharpening their weapons. When the United States entered the war in December 1941, the scale of the Atlantic conflict changed overnight. What had been a British struggle for survival became a full transatlantic war effort. Shipyards from Maine to California roared to life, launching Liberty ships faster than U-boats could sink them. In 1943 alone, American factories produced over 2,700 merchant vessels, more tonnage than Germany had destroyed in 3 years. This was the first blow to Dönitz's dream. Production. The U-boats could no longer starve the sea lanes. The sea lanes were multiplying faster than they could be choked. Meanwhile, technology was closing the gap between the surface and the depths. The British had already developed ASDIC, the early form of sonar, but now, working with American scientists, it became more powerful and precise. Allied ships could detect a submarine by the echo of its own presence, even through fog and night. And in the skies, something new appeared. Radar. Radar changed everything. Before, a U-boat could surface under cover of darkness, charge its batteries, and attack. Now, Allied aircraft equipped with radar could see through the night and the storm. German commanders soon learned that even the blackest sky offered no safety. A few faint pulses on an Allied screen could mean death minutes later. At Bletchley Park in Britain, the silent war of intelligence was reaching its own turning point. Allied cryptanalysts, aided by captured Enigma materials from U-110 and later U-559, began reading German naval communications. The once unbreakable Enigma code, the pride of the Kriegsmarine, was being cracked. Each message that left a U-boat command center could now betray its position, its orders, its intent. For the first time, the Allies were not reacting. They were anticipating. Convoys changed routes hours before Wolfpacks arrived. Hunters sailed into traps laid by those they once hunted. In 1942, German submarines still struck hard, especially off America's east coast. An episode the sailors called the Second Happy Time. From Florida to Newfoundland, tankers burned within sight of beaches. But that too was short-lived. The United States learned fast. Coastal blackouts, organized convoys, and the relentless arrival of escort destroyers and corvettes sealed off easy prey. Then came the air war over the Atlantic. The introduction of long-range patrol bombers like the B-24 Liberator and Catalina flying boats closed the mid-Atlantic gap, the vast region once beyond the reach of Allied planes. By late 1942, nowhere in the Atlantic was truly safe. The Hunter could be seen, tracked, and destroyed. Inside the German U-boat fleet, morale began to crack. Casualties rose with each patrol. Out of every 100 submariners who sailed, barely 30 would survive the war. Depth charge patterns became more precise. Hedgehog mortars, spiked projectiles launched in clusters, turned the ocean into a grid of death. Yet Dönitz refused to yield. He believed new technology, the Metox radar detector, the snorkel, and the Type Vextian electroboat, would restore the edge. But these innovations came too late, or never worked as intended. Allied adaptation was faster, their resources bottomless. By the spring of 1943, something remarkable had happened. The U-boats, once symbols of silent dominance, were on the defensive. Convoys moved with increasing confidence. Submarine pens along the French coast were bombed day and night. German supply submarines, the milch cows that refueled others at sea, were hunted down relentlessly, cutting the Wolfpacks off from endurance. The Battle of the Atlantic was turning, slowly, invisibly, but decisively. The ocean that had once seemed Germany's ally was now betraying every signal, every ripple, every movement. By May 1943, that shift would explode into a single, brutal truth. The moment historians would later call Black May, the month when the hunters finally met the full force of the prey. Life aboard a German U-boat was a world apart from any other battlefield of World War II. There was no sunlight, no open air, no space to breathe. Every patrol began with the heavy clang of the hatch sealing shut, a sound many men later said they could never forget. Inside, the submarine became both weapon and prison. The air was thick with oil fumes and sweat. The temperature swung between freezing cold and suffocating heat. Fresh water was rationed. Men went weeks without washing. The smell of diesel, mold, and unwashed bodies clung to their clothes and skin. Every pipe and cable dripped with condensation. Even the officers slept between torpedoes, using them as makeshift bunks. But these men were not cowards. They were among Germany's most disciplined and loyal sailors. To many, service in the U-boat arm was a calling. They saw themselves as an elite, silent warriors striking deep into the enemy's veins. Yet behind the pride was constant fear. Each dive meant rolling the dice with death. When depth charges exploded nearby, the lights flickered, the hull groaned like a living creature, and men prayed silently as bolts screamed under pressure. Psychological collapse was common. Claustrophobia, hallucinations, and the constant sound of sonar pings drove some to the edge. But they endured, bound by camaraderie and faith in Admiral Dönitz's vision, that the ocean itself was their ally, and that Germany's destiny depended on their endurance. Still, deep down, many knew that if they went down, they would not come back. For every U-boat lost, there were rarely survivors. The ocean gave no mercy and offered no graves. While U-boats prowled the surface, another secret war raged silently in rooms filled with paper, cables, and spinning rotors. At the center of Germany's communication system was the Enigma machine, a marvel of encryption that turned plain messages into unreadable code through a series of electrical substitutions. The Kriegsmarine's Enigma had extra rotors and daily key changes, making it far more complex than the Army version. Dönitz trusted it completely. He believed no one could break it. But he was wrong. At Bletchley Park, a small English estate hidden behind hedges and barbed wire, mathematicians and linguists, led by Alan Turing and Hugh Alexander, worked tirelessly to pierce that code. Using early electromechanical computers called bombs, they tested millions of combinations daily. It was a race between German secrecy and Allied ingenuity. Every intercepted message was a thread. One wrong assumption meant weeks of wasted effort. One lucky pattern could change the course of the war. When the Allies captured a full Enigma machine and codebooks from the U-boat U-110 in 1941, the tide quietly shifted. The Allies could now read Dönitz's operational signals, not always in real time, but often enough to anticipate the next strike. By 1942, Bletchley's decrypts, codenamed Ultra, gave Allied convoys a silent shield. Ships were rerouted away from Wolfpacks before they even surfaced. To the Germans, it seemed like luck. To the Allies, it was mathematics, patience, and the quiet triumph of intellect over fear. Dönitz never suspected the full extent of the breach. He blamed spies, careless operators, even fate. But the truth was far simpler. The unbreakable Enigma was no longer secret. And with every message sent, the U-boats unknowingly broadcast their own doom. If the Code War was hidden, the tactical war was brutally visible. The Battle of the Atlantic was a contest of organization. Between the coordinated packs of U-boats and the disciplined protection of Allied convoys. At first, the Wolfpack system was unstoppable. U-boats patrolled in loose lines, spaced across hundreds of miles of ocean. When one spotted a convoy, it shadowed from a distance, radioing its position to others. Soon, a swarm of submarines gathered, attacking at night, surfaced like ghosts in the mist. The merchant ships, silhouetted against the horizon, became perfect targets. Convoy escorts, corvettes, destroyers, and sloops fought back with depth charges and spotlights, but they were too few. The sea was vast, and the U-boats were invisible until it was too late. Entire convoys vanished. 50 ships, 60, gone in a single attack run. But the Allies learned. Convoy formations became tighter, escort ships faster, and their weapons deadlier. By late 1942, new tactics emerged. Hunter-killer groups, teams of destroyers and aircraft carriers dedicated solely to finding and eliminating submarines. Instead of reacting to attacks, they actively hunted them. The Atlantic became a battlefield of detection. Sonar pings, radar sweeps, coded transmissions. Each side raced to hear the other first. Every sound, every ripple in the water could mean life or death. And by 1943, the scales began to tip. Convoys were no longer helpless prey. They were moving fortresses. The hunters didn't know it yet, but their era was ending. At the heart of the U-boat war stood Admiral Karl Dönitz, a man whose loyalty to the submarine arm bordered on religious devotion. He was no grand strategist like Rommel or Guderian, no battlefield showman, but in his narrow domain, he was absolute. To Dönitz, the U-boat was not merely a weapon. It was the embodiment of German resilience and ingenuity. He believed that Britain, isolated and dependent on Atlantic trade, could be brought to its knees if enough tonnage were sunk. Each convoy destroyed meant starvation, industrial collapse, and despair. It was, as he called it, a war of exhaustion. But Dönitz's greatest strength, his belief in the U-boat as a decisive weapon, became his greatest flaw. Even as Allied technology advanced, even as losses mounted, he refused to reconsider. He dismissed reports that radar-equipped aircraft were turning the tide, or that Enigma might be compromised. His faith in his crews and in German engineering blinded him to the scale of change unfolding across the ocean. In meetings with Hitler, Dönitz demanded resources for more submarines. Newer, faster, deeper diving models like the Type WWII and WWII, but by the time they were ready, the war was already lost at sea. Still, his leadership held a strange power. U-boat crews revered him as Onkel Karl, a commander who understood their suffering. He visited bases, shook hands with sailors before patrols, and sent personal letters to the families of the dead. To the very end, Dönitz told them victory was near. that the Atlantic would soon belong to Germany again. It never did. It never did. If Dönitz's faith was emotional, America's response was mechanical, cold, relentless, and vast. The United States transformed war production into an industrial miracle, unlike anything the world had seen. Between 1942 and 1945, American shipyards produced over 2,700 Liberty ships and 500 Victory ships, along with thousands of escort destroyers, corvettes, and aircraft. For every U-boat Germany built, America launched dozens of ships. Where German submarines took months to assemble in hidden pens, U.S. yards like Kaiser's Richmond built a Liberty ship in as little as 4 days. Assembly lines operated day and night, welding steel under floodlights that never dimmed. The Atlantic became not just a battlefield, it became a conveyor belt of American industry. Fuel, tanks, planes, and food crossed the ocean in staggering volume. Each convoy that reached Britain meant not just supplies, but hope. And for every submarine that attacked, a dozen new ships replaced the loss. Germany's arithmetic of destruction was broken. American innovation reached into the battle itself. Long-range patrol aircraft, airborne radar, depth-charge projectors, and the Hedgehog mortar revolutionized anti-submarine warfare. Even the ocean's silence betrayed the U-boats. New sonar systems turned their stealth into a signal. The hunter had nowhere left to hide. This was the true power of the United States. Not just technology, but production. The ability to replace, rebuild, and reimagine faster than the enemy could adapt. By 1943, the U-boat war was no longer a duel of submarines and ships. It was a contest between one nation's will and another's industry. And industry won. By the middle of 1943, the aura surrounding the U-boat force began to dissolve. The same propaganda that had once glorified the submariners now felt hollow. Reports of victories were replaced by lists of missing boats. Entire crews lost without a trace. Dönitz still sent out messages of courage and faith. But every sailor knew the odds. The average U-boat crew's life expectancy had fallen below 6 patrols. Letters from home spoke of cities bombed into rubble, families gone, and an empire shrinking. The submarine men, once seen as heroes of a silent war, became ghosts in the making. Inside Germany, cracks appeared even among loyal officers. Some questioned whether the sacrifice was worth it, whether drowning in the dark Atlantic served any purpose when the war on land was already turning against them. And yet, the submariners kept sailing, out of duty, out of habit, out of the belief that somehow they might still change the course of the war. But the enemy was no longer just ships and planes. It was inevitability. For the first time, Germany's most feared weapon had lost its mystery. Every convoy survived was proof that the invisible hunters could be beaten. Every sinking submarine was a message to Berlin. The Atlantic no longer belonged to the Reich. As 1943 deepened, the stage was set for the breaking point. A month of destruction so total that it would mark the true end of Germany's underwater empire. The world would call it Black May, the month that shattered the myth of the U-boat. Invincibility. For nearly 4 years, German submarines had ruled the seas between America and Europe. But in the spring of 1943, that balance snapped, not in a single battle, but across hundreds of miles of cold, gray ocean. What unfolded was the most decisive shift in the entire Battle of the Atlantic. A turning point carved in steel, fire and silence. It began with convoy ONS-5, a slow-moving group of merchant ships heading west from Liverpool to Halifax. 50 ships, guarded by a modest escort of destroyers and corvettes. Waiting for them were over 40 U-boats, assembled into massive Wolfpacks under Dönitz's personal direction. For weeks, the submarines had struggled to find prey. Allied convoys were slipping through unseen. Now, finally, ONS-5 had been spotted. It seemed like a chance to prove the U-boats still ruled the Atlantic. The battle lasted 5 nights. At first, the Germans struck hard. Torpedoes slamming into tankers, columns of fire rising into the mist. But the escorts countered with ferocity no U-boat commander had ever seen. New Type 271 radar, improved ASDIC sonar, and Hedgehog mortars allowed the British destroyers to hunt through the darkness. Depth charges fell in endless waves. Sonar operators tracked every move, calling coordinates to gun crews with calm precision. One by one, the U-boats began to die. On May 5th, U-125 was caught on the surface by HMS Oribe and Snowflake. Trapped, the crew scuttled the boat and abandoned ship, only to vanish in the cold waters before rescue could arrive. 2 days later, U-630 was destroyed by depth charges. Another, U-531, was sunk by the corvette Vidette. By the end of the week, 6 U-boats lay at the bottom of the Atlantic. Convoy ONS-5 reached its destination, battered, but alive. Across the Kriegsmarine Command, disbelief turned to panic. Dönitz had never seen losses like this. For every U-boat that claimed a victory, 2 were being destroyed. The Wolfpacks, once coordinated killers, were now scattered prey, hunted by aircraft from the sky and destroyers from the depths. The reasons ran deeper than luck. Every element of Allied innovation now worked in unison. Airborne radar from long-range B-24 Liberators detected surfaced submarines hours before visual contact. New leak lights, massive spotlights mounted under the aircraft, turned the night into daylight as bombers dove in with depth charges. The U-boats' once safe surface charging times, the few hours before dawn when they rose to replenish batteries, had become suicide missions. In March 1943, Germany had sunk over 600,000 tons of Allied shipping. By May, that number dropped below 300,000. In the same month, 41 U-boats were lost, a catastrophic figure that tore the heart out of the U-boat fleet. Inside each submarine base along the French coast, Lorient, Brest, La Rochelle, the mood shifted from confidence to quiet dread. Families stopped coming to the docks to wave goodbye. Crews joked less. Even the propaganda reels, once showing smiling sailors, now focused on the sacrifice of the submarine service. An unspoken admission of hopelessness. In one recorded transmission, intercepted later by Allied intelligence, a U-boat commander radioed a final message before contact was lost. "We are surrounded. Surface impossible. God help us all." By mid-May, the Wolfpacks were shattered. Dozens of submarines never returned to port. Those that did came back cracked, leaking, and half the crew gone. For the first time, Admiral Dönitz ordered a temporary withdrawal from the North Atlantic. The war under the waves was no longer sustainable. He hoped it would be a pause, time to regroup, refit, and return stronger. But in truth, the U-boat arm would never recover. In just 1 month, the hunters had become history. The Battle of the Atlantic was no longer a struggle for control. It was an execution. Every convoy that crossed safely now fed the Allied war machine. Tanks for Africa, fuel for bombers, and supplies for the invasion of Europe. And while Germany still dreamed of new weapons, the advanced Type 21 U-boats that could outrun sonar and dive deeper, the oceans were already lost. The invisible empire of steel beneath the waves had collapsed, undone not by one weapon, but by the union of science, production, and relentless adaptation. By June 1943, the Kriegsmarine faced a grim truth. The U-boat campaign was no longer a weapon of war. It was a graveyard of men and machines. But Dönitz, refusing to surrender, ordered one final push. He believed a counterattack could reclaim the Atlantic. It would only deepen the disaster. The last phase of Germany's U-boat campaign began not with triumph, but with denial. In the summer of 1943, Admiral Karl Dönitz sat in his operations bunker near Paris, staring at maps filled with red markers, each representing a U-boat lost, each a crew erased. The numbers were impossible to ignore. 41 submarines lost in May, 34 more in June, 24 in July. At that rate, his entire fleet would vanish before the year's end. Yet Dönitz refused to believe the war in the Atlantic was over. He told Hitler that the losses were temporary, that new technology, new tactics, and new U-boats could restore Germany's reach. To his staff, he spoke of resilience. To his men, he spoke of duty. But in private, even he began to understand the truth. The hunters he had sent into the ocean were not coming back. Germany's answer to defeat was innovation, but innovation came too late. The Metox radar detector, once believed to give submarines early warning of Allied aircraft, had already been countered by new radar frequencies. The snorkel, designed to let U-boats run diesel engines while submerged, arrived only in 1944, when the Atlantic was fully under Allied control. And the revolutionary type WWII electroboat, a marvel of underwater design capable of high submerged speed, remained trapped in shipyards, bombed before it could ever sail. Dönitz had placed his faith in the future. The Allies had already mastered the present. Every improvement Germany made was met by a faster Allied response. Convoys now sailed under the protection of escort carriers, floating airfields that brought radar and bombers to the mid-ocean. Destroyers carried forward-throwing hedgehog mortars capable of saturating a submarine's last known position before it could dive again. The ocean was no longer vast. It was mapped, scanned, and patrolled with ruthless precision. For the U-boat crews, the change was suffocating. Patrols that once felt like silent hunts now felt like slow executions. Each time a submarine surfaced to charge batteries, radar-equipped aircraft appeared on the horizon. Each time they transmitted to headquarters, their signals were triangulated within hours. The men no longer believed they were predators. They knew they were prey. In Lorient and Saint-Nazaire, the once busy submarine pens echoed with emptiness. New recruits replaced veterans faster than they could be trained. Many of the young men boarding the boats in 1943 were barely 20 years old. Boys stepping into a machine that had already written their fate. They knew the odds. 1 in 3 would return. Still, they saluted, boarded, and disappeared beneath the waves. The myth of the invincible submarine fleet had collapsed into quiet fatalism. In August 1943, Dönitz made the decision he had sworn never to make. He ordered the suspension of large-scale operations in the North Atlantic. The Wolfpacks, the pride of the Kriegsmarine, were officially withdrawn. It was a retreat masked as strategy, described in orders as redeployment. But everyone knew what it meant. The Battle of the Atlantic was lost. The U-boat war, the campaign that had once promised to starve Britain, isolate America, and decide the fate of Europe, was over. In its place, Germany would focus on defensive patrols, coastal operations, and desperate attempts to guard the shrinking supply lines to Norway and the Baltic. The submarines no longer shaped the war. They merely delayed its end. For the Allies, the psychological victory was as great as the strategic one. For the first time since 1939, the Atlantic was open. A bridge of steel and fuel stretching from New York to Liverpool. Troops, tanks, and aircraft streamed across in endless convoys. The foundations of Operation Overlord, the D-Day invasion, were laid not on beaches, but in the freedom of the sea. Without victory in the Atlantic, Normandy would have been impossible. In Berlin, however, Hitler refused to accept the meaning of the collapse. He blamed faulty equipment, lazy commanders, and even the weather. Dönitz, loyal to the end, never contradicted him. He continued to write optimistic reports, promising the Führer that new boats will soon turn the tide. But by late 1943, Dönitz no longer believed his own words. His fleet was dying, his men were dying, and his war beneath the waves, once Germany's proudest weapon, had become a monument to sacrifice without result. By the close of that year, the Atlantic was quiet again, but it was not peace. It was the silence of finality. Beneath the surface lay hundreds of submarines, twisted hulls and shattered steel, resting forever in the cold. The hunters who once stalked the ocean now lay entombed in it, unseen, unremembered by most, but forming one of the largest mass graves in history. The Battle of the Atlantic had taken nearly 75,000 lives, most of them young men who never saw land again. Their commanders called it duty. History would call it tragedy. And yet, from that tragedy rose the power that would decide the rest of the war. The Atlantic was open, and across it, America was coming. When the last Wolfpacks retreated from the North Atlantic, they left behind more than wrecks. They left behind an entire strategy in ruins. The numbers told the story better than any headline ever could. Between 1939 and 1945, Germany had built 1,162 operational U-boats. Of those, over 780 were destroyed, nearly 70% of the entire fleet. The human cost was even more staggering. Out of approximately 40,000 submariners, more than 30,000 never returned. The German U-boat service suffered one of the highest casualty rates of any branch in military history. At sea, the change was visible in every convoy. By 1944, the ocean lanes once terrorized by U-boats had become highways of Allied power. Convoy losses, which had reached catastrophic levels just 2 years before, now dropped to almost zero. Radar, sonar, escort carriers, and airborne patrols formed an unbreakable chain from North America to Britain. The Atlantic, once called the graveyard of ships, was now an Allied lifeline. The shift in production told its own story. In 1943 alone, Germany managed to launch 237 submarines, a technical feat under constant bombing. But America and Britain together built nearly 38 million tons of merchant shipping that same year. Every time a U-boat sank one freighter, Allied factories replaced it with 10 more. It was the industrial scale of war, a contest Germany could never win. In the United States, the transformation was monumental. Factories in Detroit, Pittsburgh, and California turned out engines, steel, and planes in volumes unmatched in history. Women welded hulls. Teenagers assembled aircraft. Civilian yards like Kaiser's in Oregon built a Liberty ship every few days. The idea that Germany could starve Britain into surrender had become absurd. Instead, the Atlantic became a river flowing in reverse, from the New World to the Old, carrying everything needed to destroy the Third Reich. By 1944, Allied ship production and air power had completely erased the threat of the U-boats. Long-range aircraft patrolled the Arctic routes to Murmansk, the western convoy lanes to New York, and the southern passages to Gibraltar. Even the once feared Black Gap in mid-ocean, the deadly zone where no aircraft had once reached, was now constantly scanned by radar and patrol planes. For the German crews still at sea, the war became a slow extinction. Submarines sent on patrol rarely came back. Those that did return cracked, half-flooded, with survivors traumatized and silent. The pride of 1940 had become the despair of 1944. Each man knew the truth. They were fighting a war already lost. Inside Germany, Dönitz ordered desperate measures: crash programs for snorkel systems, radar-absorbing coatings, and electroboats. But Allied bombing raids on shipyards and coastal bases shattered those hopes. By the time the new generation of U-boats was ready in 1945, it was far too late. The Allies ruled both air and sea. air, and sea. The strategic meaning of this collapse went beyond the ocean. Control of the Atlantic gave the Allies something far greater than shipping lanes. It gave them momentum. It allowed Operation Overlord, the D-Day invasion of June 1944, to exist at all. The fuel, weapons, and men who crossed into Normandy did so because the sea was safe. Without the fall of the U-boats, the liberation of Europe would have been delayed by years, perhaps lost entirely. The victory over Germany began not on the beaches of France, but in the gray, cold waters of the Atlantic, where American production and Allied innovation broke the back of Hitler's last strategic hope. But even as the Allies moved forward, the question remained: what became of the men and the nation that had built its pride on invisible power? That part of the story unfolded not in shipyards or factories, but in the hearts of those who survived. When the war ended in May 1945, the ocean was quieter than it had been in years. The thunder of depth charges, the hum of radar, the cries over the radio, all had faded. But beneath the stillness lay thousands of wrecks, silent witnesses to the most relentless campaign in naval history. In ports along the French and Norwegian coasts, the surviving U-boats, fewer than 150 seaworthy vessels, surrendered one by one to Allied fleets. Their crews, gaunt and hollow-eyed, stepped onto the decks not as warriors, but as remnants of a broken dream. Many were barely out of adolescence. They saluted the Allied officers who came aboard, then stood silently as the flags of the Reich were lowered. Some wept. Others simply stared at the sea, unable to speak. For them, survival carried no victory. Most had lost friends, commanders, or entire flotillas. The war that once filled them with pride had turned into a slow suicide beneath the waves. Out of 40,000 German submariners, only 10,000 came home. 1 in 4. The rest remained forever in their steel coffins. A generation entombed under the Atlantic. In the months that followed Germany's surrender, the Allies faced a grim task: disposing of the very weapons that had once terrorized the seas. Under Operation Deadlight, more than 100 captured U-boats were towed into the open ocean and scuttled by gunfire and explosives. One by one, the submarines that had haunted the Atlantic were sent to the bottom, this time not by force of war, but by the judgment of peace. As the last hull slipped beneath the surface, the age of the U-boat ended, but its legacy endured, not as triumph, but as warning. The Battle of the Atlantic had proved something greater than victory or defeat. It revealed that technology alone could not win a war. Germany's U-boats had been marvels of engineering, faster, deeper diving, more advanced than anything the Allies possessed in 1939. But the Allies had mastered something more powerful: adaptation. They learned, they shared, they built, and they never stopped improving. It was this unity, Britain's endurance, America's industry, and the shared flow of intelligence between nations that reshaped the war's outcome. In the post-war years, the lessons of the U-boat war became the foundation of modern naval strategy. Radar, sonar, and code-breaking evolved into the core of Cold War technology. NATO naval doctrine was built upon the principle that control of the Atlantic meant control of the future. Submarines would rise again, quieter, deadlier, powered by nuclear engines. But the ghosts of the old fleet remained beneath them, a reminder of where arrogance leads and where endurance prevails. For Germany, the memory of the U-boat arm became both pride and pain. In the 1950s, when West Germany was allowed to rebuild a navy, many of its officers were former U-boat men. They carried with them not the boast of conquest, but the caution of experience. The new submarines of the Bundesmarine would never again seek domination, only defense. The ocean had taught its lesson too deeply to forget. By the end of the 20th century, divers and explorers began finding the wrecks again. rusting shapes half buried in sand and silt, each one a tomb, each one a memory of how the ocean, once ruled by fear, had outlasted every empire. Their story wasn't just about loss, it was about change. Because the Battle of the Atlantic had done more than destroy Germany's U-boats. It had built something new, the modern world's belief in industrial unity, technological cooperation, and shared intelligence. The victory over the U-boats wasn't just an Allied triumph. It was the blueprint for a new kind of warfare and a new kind of peace. The Atlantic was no longer a graveyard. It had become a bridge between continents, between allies, between the past and the future,